The rhetoric from yesterday's new U.S. tariffs on aluminum and steel continued to play out on social media today. It would seem that tit-for-tat trade tactics have officially begun. The president of the EU's executive body has announced countermeasures against the planned tariffs. Jean-Claude Juncker says that the 28-nation bloc will treat American products the same way, taking aim at exports of Harley-Davidson, bourbon, and blue jeans. The director of Unifor out of Quebec said the U.S. is using tariffs as a trade weapon. It's no accident that these duties were announced while NAFTA talks are underway. Meanwhile, Unifor President Jerry Dias says if Canada is not exempted from the tariffs, we should walk away from the NAFTA negotiations altogether. All this followed on new tweets from President Donald Trump this morning. The U.S. is losing many billions of dollars on trade with virtually every country it does business with, and that trade wars are good and easy to win. Caught in the middle of this political spat, Canadian steel companies are pushing back against the claim that trade between the two countries is unfair. According to figures from the Canadian Steel Producers Association, the dollar value of trade between us is actually fairly even, with roughly $6 billion in steel crossing each border last year. Donald Trump's proposed tariffs would strike this country harder than most, and plenty of U.S. workers could be hurt too. Susan Prince has been looking at the numbers and joins me now. Susan, what's at stake for Canada if we find out at whatever point next week that we are not exempted from these tariffs?
Right, Peter. Well, what's at stake is that Canada, as you mentioned, the trade balance is about even when we look at steel, but Canada exports over $9 billion worth of aluminum to the United States for things like beer cans and pop cans and other types of manufacturing, in addition to the $5.5 billion of steel that goes into the U.S. markets. So it's not surprising that Jerry Dias, who is the head of the Steelworkers Union, Unifor, has recommended that Canadians be prepared to walk away from negotiations if, in fact, this tariff is enacted against Canada as well as other countries. So we certainly have a fair bit at stake when you look at what our business, what a portion of our export business is to the U.S.
Right. Now, I mean, this would have a lot of repercussions for a whole lot of countries. Do we know how this is expected to benefit the U.S. economy?
Well, the benefits are really dubious. And in fact, in an editorial today by the Wall Street Journal, they characterized this as the quote, and I'm quoting this, the biggest policy blunder of the U.S. presidency. You know, what we're looking at is economists are shaking their heads at this tariff because American manufacturers have pointed out that American manufacturing that uses steel accounts for about 6.5 million workers in the U.S. when you look at auto parts workers and aerospace and construction. And jobs in the steel industry are about 140,000 jobs. So you're seeing that it's the tail wagging the dog in many respects. And today, 22 of the 30 Dow Jones members have responded to what their outlook is, what their feelings are about this tariff. And by and large, they have said that they feel it's negative. A good example is the Retail Association of the United States, which had this to say about the possible tariffs. And they say if broadly applied, these tariffs will have a downstream impact on every sector and will raise the stakes for other countries to take retaliatory measures that will hurt American exporters. So, and Walmart is highlighted there because it was the retail sector that is commenting on this. But you could go across the board if you look at Morgan Stanley, Coca-Cola. Each of these sectors has looked at it and said, you know, this is not good for the American economy. So a lot of concerns regardless of which side of the border you're on.
Indeed. All right. Thanks for this, Susan.
Thanks, Peter.
All right, to tie all this together and to look at where things just may go from here, we're joined by Dan Eikenson, director of the Cato Institute's Center for Trade Policies. I want to circle back on something that's a little deep in the weeds, but I think matters here, that the way he's introducing these tariffs is through a national security measure. You raised that issue in your piece, saying, well, now we can have all kinds of countries raising all kinds of national security issues on economic questions of their own.
Yes, the statute invoked here is something called Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which permits the president to respond to perceived threats to national security by raising tariffs or quotas. The GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the precursor to the World Trade Organization, in 1947 it was established, and governments got together and said, look, freeing trade is good. It's important for economic growth, for good relations among nations. But the number one priority of governments is to protect its citizens. So what if we need to raise tariffs to address a national security threat? They said, okay, we'll have these provisions, but use them sparingly and only under the most severe of circumstances. I think Trump using them under these circumstances is frivolous, makes a mockery of it, and it's going to encourage countries like China, which perceives its dependence on foreign technology and semiconductors to be a national security threat,
right.
To really badger Western companies and make it more difficult there. Europeans to do something like that. Indians like food security. They'd like to keep out Canadian and American grains. So the bar has been lowered substantially.